This is a summary of Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Our mind operates via two distinct systems. System 1 is fast, intuitive, emotional, and operates automatically. System 2 is slow, more analytical and deliberate. System 1 can handle only limited amounts of information, so it has to constantly be filtering out the unimportant stuff to keep from getting overwhelmed. It does this filtering based on past experiences stored in memory, which means that System 1 is prone to making mistakes because of how these memories are stored. For example, if your past experiences tell you that a black swan is an extremely rare event, then when presented with a new situation involving a black swan, System 1 will automatically assume that it must be rare, even if there's no reason to believe that. This is an example of a cognitive bias called the availability bias, because we tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily brought to mind, like black swans. Cognitive biases are systematic ways in which our judgments and decisions go wrong. We actually have many other biases as well, such as the confirmation bias, which makes us seek out and favor information that confirms our existing beliefs while ignoring or downplaying information that contradicts them. These biases are problematic because they prevent us from being objective and rational in our thinking. Instead, they lead us to make irrational decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate information. Despite this, System 1 is still extremely useful because it allows us to function in daily life. Most of the time, it's good enough to make decisions quickly without having to put too much thought into it. However, it's important to be aware of the limitations of System 1 and its tendency to make errors. If we can catch ourselves when we're relying too heavily on intuition or gut feeling, then we can switch to System 2 and think more deliberately before making a decision. One way that System 1 can lead us astray is through what Kahneman calls framing effects. The way in which information is presented to us can significantly influence our choices even if the underlying probabilities are the same. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're at a store and you see a shirt for $100. You start to walk away, but then you see a sign that says 30 off. So you come back and buy the shirt for $70. Now imagine that the shirt is 30, but the sign says 70% off. Even though the discount is the same, you probably wouldn't buy the shirt in this case, right? That's because the way in which the discount is framed makes a big difference. When it's presented as a percentage, we tend to see it as a higher value than when it's presented as a monetary amount. So we're more likely to buy the shirt when it's framed as 30 off rather than 70% off. Kahneman explains that this is because of the way in which our minds process information. System 1 is more influenced by the way something is presented to us, whereas System 2 requires more effort to process the information more deeply. In the first example, System 1 takes over and we see the 30 off sign, which triggers a response in us. We don't really have to think about it. We just feel like it's a good deal. But in the second example, System 2 kicks in because we have to do some mental math to figure out what 70% of $30 is. And during that time, we have a chance to reflect on whether we really need the shirt or not. By the time we get to the checkout, we might decide that it's not worth the money and leave it behind. Another example of framing effects is in the way that we perceive risk. People are generally risk-averse, meaning that they prefer to avoid risks if possible. However, the way in which risks are framed can influence our decisions. Kahneman provides the example of a disease that affects 600 people in a population. He then asks, which of these options would you choose? A, 400 people will be saved. B, 100 people will die. At first glance, it seems like option A is better because it results in more lives being saved. But upon further reflection, you realize that option B is actually better because it specifies that 100 people will die, whereas option A doesn't say anything about deaths. Therefore, we should choose option B because it's less risky. But that's not what most people choose. In this case, People tend to opt for option A, even though option B is technically less risky. That's because the way in which the options are framed influences how we process the information. Option A frames the situation in terms of lives saved, which appeals to our emotions and triggers System 1 thinking. Option B, on the other hand, frames the situation in terms of lives lost, which makes it seem more risky and activates System 2 thinking. As a result, people tend to choose option A, even though it's technically riskier. Now that you know about these biases and framing effects, you might think that you're now immune to them, but the truth is that everyone is affected by them, including experts in their field. Biases are deeply ingrained in the way that our brains process information. They're based on our past experiences and the way that we perceive the world around us, and they're a natural byproduct of our cognitive abilities. No one is immune to them, no matter how smart or experienced they are. So how can we hope to avoid making biased decisions if they're a natural part of the way that our brains work? Well, the first step is awareness. By understanding how biases work and what they can do to our decision-making, we can start to recognize them when they arise. This isn't always easy, as biases often operate in ways that we're not aware of. But with practice, we can become more attuned to the ways in which our thinking can be skewed. Once we've become aware of our biases, we can start to take steps to mitigate their effects. This might mean taking a step back and thinking more deliberately about a decision before making it, or it might mean seeking out the advice of others to get a different perspective. It's also important to be aware of the ways in which we can be manipulated by framing effects. By understanding how the way that information is presented to us can influence our decisions, we can be more careful about the information that we consume and the choices that we make. Overall, while we can never hope to be completely free of cognitive biases, we can strive to be more aware of them and take steps to mitigate their effects. By doing so, we can improve the quality of our decisions and become more rational thinkers. And that's the end of this video. If you want to learn more from my book summaries, then stay tuned for more content. Thanks for watching. See you next time.